I remember several years ago, the first time I started learning about the Palo Alto, I got my CNSE back in those days with version 4.x of the code. And the first time I went to actually use and deploy the firewall, I had a whole bunch of error messages, which I thought were really confusing at the time. But now that we understand how it works, they make a lot more sense. And I wanted to share a little bit of that insight regarding application objects and some of their dependencies and how that operates and works inside the Palo Alto firewall to save you a bunch of time and effort as you work with and deploy a Palo Alto firewall. Let's begin. In a typical security policy, we're going to have things like DNS, which uses UDP port 53, ping, which is ICMP, SSL using TCP port 443, and web browsing, which uses TCP port 80 for HTTP. And the application default simply says we're looking for those applications on their well-known and expected ports. However, what if we want to get more granular about what Bob is able to do on the web? For example, maybe we want to limit what he can do while he's browsing on the web. And Facebook is a great example. And so is Google. And I'm not talking about just the search engine. I'm talking about all the cool Google apps that are out there, like Calendar and Mail and collaboration services, such as Google Hangouts and so forth. What if we want Bob to have access to some of those features, but not others? Well, one of the great things about App ID is that we can have granular control by specifically identifying and telling the Palo Alto firewall, hey, this is allowed, but this isn't. And an easy way of doing that is using specific apps for things like Facebook and Google, and specifically for subsets of Facebook and subsets of Google. For example, with Facebook, there's an application object called Facebook Base. And this application object called Facebook Base is just very much what it sounds like. It's basic access to Facebook. However, Facebook Base by itself doesn't allow a whole bunch of additional features inside of Facebook, such as chat and video, and the list goes on. So what we could do, if we want Bob to be able to go to Facebook and we want to give him chat and video and XYZ, we could specifically add additional application objects for each of those children, if you will, those subsets of Facebook. So if we don't want Bob to have chat, we simply don't allow the chat subset, that application object for chat, and we don't include that as part of an allow or a permit inside of our security policy. And that way Bob can have access to Facebook with Facebook-base, plus the other specifics that we've given him, but not chat. And we have a similar treatment for Google. There's an application object called Google-base, which gives basic access for Google services, but at the same time, not all the apps below it. For example, Google Calendar and so forth. Now, inside an application object, it may depend on some other application being permitted for the application object to work. For example, if we want Facebook chat to be enabled, that's going to depend on Facebook-base to also be allowed. That would be a dependency. So what that means is, if we want to allow Facebook chat, we either need to, in that same rule in our security policy, enable Facebook base, or if we don't want to have it be part of that same exact rule, like rule number 2, we can put it as a separate line item inside of our security policy. And here's the bottom line. If we have an application object that depends on another application object being permitted for that one to work, we need to make sure we include it as part of our security policy. And we can kind of think of it like a brick wall. Let's imagine a brick wall with 3 rows of bricks, 1, 2, and 3. Here's my question. For row 2 and row 3, do they need row 1 in place in order to be functional? And the answer is yes. If the first row of bricks is not there, we can't put row 2 and 3 on top of a non-existent row. So regarding Facebook, we might have Facebook base, and then on top of that, we might have chat. So that's going to be a nice way to help us remember that if we have an application object that we're using and it's got a dependency, we need to make sure that dependency is somewhere being permitted inside of our security policy. Now, a few versions of Palo Alto ago, it was not as convenient as it is today, because currently for many, not all, but for many of our application objects, they also have an option of implicitly uses. And if you and I are using an application object, and part of that application object says this implicitly uses XYZ, that means that you and I don't have to manually add X, Y, and Z because it'll just go ahead and automatically use it implicitly. Here's an example. Let's go ahead and take Facebook again, and let's get a new space here. Let's go over here. So let's say we're going to go ahead and use Facebook base as an application object. The details for the Facebook-base application object would show that this Facebook-base implicitly uses two additional objects, two additional application objects. And they are web browsing, which we know and love as TCP port 80 for HTTP, and SSL. So what that means is that today, if we said Facebook-base is an application that we want to allow through our network, we wouldn't have to have separate explicit rules for web browsing and SSL for the Facebook base to work. Now what this also means is that if Bob the user tries to go out to www.cisco.com or some other site, if this is the only rule that we have as a permit in our policy, Bob will be able to go to Facebook, and Facebook more and more is using SSL for secured connections between the clients and the Facebook servers. That'll all be allowed as long as the application that Bob is using is Facebook. Now, somewhere else in our security policy, we may have a separate rule for web browsing. And if we did have a separate rule just for web browsing, that would allow Bob to go ahead and go to other sites like Cisco and Juniper and Palo Alto, etc., that were not delivering the Facebook content. Now, I've got a question for you. Based on what we've talked about up to this point in this nugget, with this rule in place, the Facebook-base, which implicitly calls upon the web browsing and SSL objects, what would happen if Bob tried to do a chat or a video inside of Facebook, if this was the only rule that we had in place? And if you're saying, well, Keith, based on this discussion over here, if we don't also add the specific capabilities of chat and video, etc., Bob would be very, very restricted on what he could do in Facebook. He'd have basic functionality, but he wouldn't have the additional features unless we also had rules for those specific applications to be allowed on the network. And if that's what you said, awesome, way to go, because that's how it works. It's that time, assessment check time. Pause the music, take a look at these questions. We'll review them together in just a few moments. Enjoy. All right, question number one. What are the implied apps that are used by the application object called Facebook-base? And those are web browsing and SSL. Question number two. When do we manually have to permit a supporting app? And the answer to that is when it is a dependency. So if the application object that we're using shows a dependency that's not implied, we need to manually also allow that dependency. Whether it's in that same rule or somewhere else in our security policy, it needs to be present in order for this app that we're trying to apply to work. And then third, I think I just gave it away, why might we not have to allow a supporting app? And that's if it's implied. And a good example of that is Facebook-base. It implies the use of SSL as well as web browsing as part of the application called Facebook-base. And to see the details of the application objects, simply go to Objects in the Palo Alto Firewall, click on the applications on the left, and go look at the details of the application object that you're interested in learning more about. And that'll have the latest and greatest information regarding the applications on your Palo Alto Firewall. In this nugget, we've discussed the idea that we can use very granular application objects, such as Facebook-chat, to allow or permit specific applications through the firewall at a very granular level. And for a demonstration of implementing very granular control within an environment like Facebook, we're going to do that together in a separate nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.